It's a negotiation with life.
Good afternoon or evening, I'm not sure which it is. Probably afternoon still. Welcome to Walsh Family Hall. I would like to particularly greet those who are members of the Advisory Council. The Council weekend starts tonight. I also would like to acknowledge those who are visiting from outside the school and about 60 people who are following us on the internet. Thank you all for being here. Tonight's lecture is going to be given by Ben Pentreath, and it is the lecture that is the result of his being named the 2023 holder of the Driehaus Prize. Ben is a friend of the school. He's a person we know and love well, both him personally as a colleague and his work. So I hope he's not going to be embarrassed by the formality of my introduction, which I thought should be heard by all of you, because it is really the citation of the jury. Citations of these juries, there's a jury of seven architects, and the citations are written in concert between these parties. So they are in a sense agreements about how and why this particular person was chosen among probably 70 people considered. So it is a special statement. It is worth reading. 2023 jury citation, Richard H. Driehaus Prize at the University of Notre Dame. In honor of his leadership in advocating and practicing a new classical vernacular architecture in tandem with a new urbanism, and in appreciation of the inspiring character and quality of his built work, Ben Pentreath is the recipient of the 2023 Richard H. Driehaus Prize at the University of Notre Dame. As a luminary within a rising generation of architects, his work encompasses what the prize celebrates most: beauty, durability, and a commitment to place. Pentreath's deep understanding of construction allows him to create and practice architecture and urbanism across all scales, from the rural vernacular to the monumental. He does so effortlessly, in harmony with the local landscape, with heritage, climate, and culture of the settings where his work is rooted, which lends an aura of both authenticity and cultural continuity to it. He has exhibited a notable ability to operate within a number of formal traditions and languages, from the Gothic to various periods of classical architecture to the vernacular, and to infuse them all with new rigor and new meaning. Pentreath has excelled since he was a student at the University of Edinburgh, graduating with first-class honors in history of art and architecture in 1995. Sorry for the placing it that way, Ben. While attending the Prince of Wales Institute of Architecture, he won the student competition for his design for the Poet Laurel Pub on Palmerston Square. I like that particular reference, in Poundbury. After working in New York and with the Prince's Foundation for the Built Environment, teaching and working within London schools, he established his own architectural practice in 2004. Asserting his impeccable understanding of typological precedent, urban form priorities, and how people thrive, he has built significant projects that grace the neighborhoods of Poundbury and other new towns in the UK, including Truro and Tornagrain. The designs unerringly establish a sense of place, whether new or in the transformation of the existing. The maturity, elegance, and understated quality of the design, even for monumental buildings, is a hallmark of Pentreath's style. Most importantly, the work conveys a sense of stewardship, of conservation, and investment should be an essential part of the solutions that address the environmental crisis of our time. Their durable construction and arrangement of interior spaces to take advantage of natural lighting and ventilation and placement and siting in mixed-use walkable cities and towns and villages offer alternatives to the current notions of green architecture, which typically relies solely on technological solutions. He has the unique ability to apply the same attention to detail for public housing projects for private families, and to institutional and public commissions. His architecture is uncompromisingly both familiar and clearly new. The Pentreath practice employs more than 40 architects, urban designers, and interior designers in his London office. His interior design shop, Pentreath & Hall, which he co-owns with the artist Bridie Hall, is one of the most influential studios in the London design world. And that is the end of the citation. So it is with great pleasure and as a seriously great honor to have you here among us today, Ben. We're very happy for you, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanos.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hello. Friends, students, staff, fellowship of the university, and great thanks to Stephanos. I wanted to start, if I may, by thanking everyone for inviting me here to spend some time back with the university over the next few days. Marianne, my great friend, has just given me a wonderful tour, a whistle-stop tour of the building and everything that's going on. And it's incredibly inspiring and exciting to see the energy and the work and the output and everyone working away. And I think we all know that if you're spending your time in your studio kind of glued to a piece of paper and scribbling your designs and trying to work it all out, you can sometimes get quite close to kind of what you're doing and find it quite hard to step away from the and see the bigger picture and see the bigger picture. And whereas I'm here coming in for the first time actually in this wonderful building, and it is literally mind-blowing to see everything you're up to. So thank you for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here. And I was asked to speak a little bit this evening about the work of our practice. It's a subject which I've been giving a bit of thought to recently because I'm in the process of putting together, writing and actually taking the photographs of a new book which I'm writing for Rizzoli of all of our work in the office, which will come out next year. But I've been writing it recently and pulling everything together. And it's fascinating for me. As Stephanos just mentioned, I set up in the year 2004. And so here we are, nearly 20 years on. And on the one hand, you look back on life and think how much has changed. And on the other hand, it seems like only yesterday that Marianne and I were working together on the first ever project that I worked on. It was a competition entry for a new housing scheme in Northamptonshire, which I wasn't quite sure if I would win the competition, but I knew if I did that I'd need some help to get through the next stage at a very, very fast timescale. And I called Marianne. We were reminiscing about this today at lunch. I called her and I said, can't quite promise you a job, but I might be able to, and would you come? And she did. And we got through it and we did all of our work. And that was, 20 years ago. And it's amazing how time flies. This little screen on the board just shows some of the buildings that I've designed over the last few years. I'm afraid if you get a model made, it means that you're not getting built. It's, I can't remember which of my architect friends it was I was talking to recently, Michael Imber, who said that you design a building and then it enters a negotiation with life. The first negotiation is with your client. If you've listened to their desires carefully, then hopefully that won't be too bad of a negotiation. The next negotiation is with planning officers, which is a terrible burden in England, let me tell you. Most of these ones have hit the buffers from planning. And then you enter the negotiation with budgets and builders and reality. And every now and again, one of your designs makes it through to the other end. And that's some of what we'll be looking at today. But just while I'm giving my preamble, I thought it would be nice to have a prettier picture to look at. Of course, in the middle of that all is the beautiful model, which was my wonderful treehouse maquette, which I'm so honored and thrilled to have received. Now, looking sort of, I won't quite say that I'm looking at my life in the rearview mirror, but I'm 20 years in and it's a moment of pause and you sort of stop and you have a little think and you think, what's it all about? It's actually not very easy for me necessarily to kind of make sense of all of this. And part of Stephanos's very embarrassing citation rereading sort of possibly demonstrates why. I'm an architectural designer. I actually can't call myself an architect because I'm afraid I never actually completed a full program of architectural study. Every now and again in England, I will get written up in a newspaper, and the lazy journalist, despite my being very careful and saying it's a protected title in England, the word architect, and so you can't call me that. You have to call me an architectural designer. They're just a bit lazy and they use the word, and within 2 seconds I get a complaint letter from the Architects Registration Board. So there you go. But as well as being an architectural designer, I'm also highly involved in the world of urbanism, and on the other end of the spectrum, I love working on interior decoration and interior design projects. And there are lots of architects who work in urban design, and there's a huge crossover. Where does one stop and where does the other start? There are lots of architects who are involved in interior design and decoration, but actually there aren't that many who are literally kind of like in a normal day for me in the office. I might be leaving a meeting where literally I've been discussing kind of like cushion pipings or kind of what pillows people are having on the sofa. And I will then be going into a meeting on one of our big urban design projects where we are laying out street networks or talking about below ground drainage. And it's kind of it's a broad spectrum. Now, in all of this, I actually kind of like draw inspiration from how people thought in history, because all of these specializations of subject matter, of these little silos of design that we all find ourselves in these days. I mean, let's face it, I work on projects where there are offices now, huge design studios who purely exist to design audiovisual systems. You know, this is a specialism that didn't exist even 30 or 40 years ago. You know, there are companies who just do telephones. It's like design telephone systems. It's like, what? Then mobile phones came along. Sort of, why do we need all of this? In the 18th century, in the 17th century, there was, before the rise of the professional architectural profession, there was really an astonishing blurring of all of these disciplines. And I personally draw huge inspiration from that. This image is the great 18th century Scottish architect, Robert Adam. I'm sure many of you will, if you visited the UK, you will have seen beautiful buildings and urban developments by Adam. This is the now demolished Adelphi on the banks of the River Thames in London. He was designing major urban projects. He was designing huge country houses. He was designing plasterwork ceilings for his houses. He was designing furniture and silverware. He was designing everything down to the doorknobs. And that, for me, is a very inspirational approach to life. And I think that one of the things which I've been impressed by kind of just in my 10 minutes, 15 minutes walking around your studios is seeing all of this work happening at all of the different scales and levels, starting obviously when we were in the wonderful furniture building, cabinetry workshops, which are just incredible. And then within 10 minutes, I was upstairs in the top floor studios looking at huge urban projects. But I think it's incredibly important to realize that you can keep that different connectivity of scale all through your work and through your lives. When I was thinking for my book about these themes that inform my work and kind of like which try and cut across these different disciplines of urbanism and interiors and architecture, I began to try and think of it in a series of short essays, which have titles a bit like happiness, a sense of happiness, a sense of history, a sense of character or individuality, a sense of place, of color, a sense of imperfection, I think a really important one in the world today. These are all topics that could be a talk in itself, but for me, one of the most important sort of guiding principles of my work and some of the things that I've been thinking about and our ideas and our projects is a sense of time. And that's why I decided to call this talk Designing to the Rhythms of Time. And time is an astonishing thing. It's the one thing that we all share in common. It's actually fascinating to me with some of our very wealthy, sometimes private clients. They've still only got a day, the same as everyone else. You know, they might have a dozen houses around the world and lots of things, but they only have a day. And the one thing they're always really short of is time. And that's the one thing which we're all given the same amount of. The other fascinating thing about time is that you can't sort of make it up. You can't deny it. You can't fake it. You can't, I mean, it's also fascinating to me how sometimes in the world of private client architecture, everybody wants everything to be instantly old. You know, they want their houses to be instantly old, their new house, and they spend a lot of money on specialist people to come in and make the house look way older than it originally did. And then I look over at them and I think, wow, and you're spending a lot of money to make yourself look way younger than you are. And it's just an interesting dichotomy. But the best thing of all is just letting time take its time. And obviously, it's fascinating because in the world of traditional architecture and urbanism that we all in this building are operating in, often time is the ingredient that is the greatest gift to our designs and our places. Like when I'm designing an urban development, you know, when it's first finished, it actually seems quite strange, quite raw, quite unsettled. You go back after even 2 years, we'll see some slides in a minute, the little trees that you planted just as whips, you know, small little trees, you know, within 2 or 3 years, they're really beginning, or the hedges are beginning to flourish. People are taking control, they're doing their gardening, they're messing things up, they're making it theirs, not mine anymore. It's getting less and less, in a sense, perfect, but getting way more perfect as a result, because it's to do with this engagement between time and place. Old buildings, when they're traditional buildings, I should say, when they're first built, can seem sort of curiously unsettling sometimes to see brand new stonework or brand new brickwork. You go back to that building 10 or 15 years later when weathering has happened and, you know, plants are growing, and suddenly the building has an immense feeling of belonging in its place and being settled. That's for me, one of the huge joys of working with traditional architecture and materials. They get older and better. They get better the older they are. Whereas we see so many contemporary buildings that you must take a photograph of on the first day that the contractor has left. And if you go back after 15 or 20 or 30 or 50 years, it just looks terrible. You know, the whole environment looks degraded and broken. And that's one of the beauties of what we're doing. It is essentially a timeless form of architecture. There was a famous English novelist called Agatha Christie. I'm not sure if any of you will have read that, but she used to famously say that the nicest thing about being married to an archaeologist, as she was, is that the older she got, the more interested he became in her, the more attractive he found her. So I'm going to take you on a little journey through the projects. I'm going to canter through as many slides as I can. I think Stefanos might have seen the number of slides I've got in my presentation and said you might need to work on it. When we get to a point where you've had enough, I'll just stop. It's kind of fine. There's no plan, but I'm just going to talk you through some of our different scales of work. And I'm going to start with slow time. I just need to move that forward. So lento, the Italian for the musicians amongst you, playing a slow beat. And for me, this is to do with urbanism. And I'm going to start by showing you not one of my buildings. You will be glad to hear. But this is a building in a little town very close to where I live in Dorset. It's called Weymouth. Weymouth is a little town on the south coast. It's a beautiful little port harbour town. And it's very close to Dorchester, which is where Poundbury is, which we'll be looking at soon as well. So if you ever come, it's well worth a visit to Weymouth. And right in the middle of Weymouth is this building, which was the Civic Hall built in the mid-1960s. And I often say to people, if you want to find civic government or planning and design officers in any town in England, walk around until you find the ugliest building, and that is where the officers in charge of the new designs will always be. And even if you go to a nice, beautiful Victorian town hall, and you're like, hi, could you send me to the planning department? They say, yep, just turn left through there across the courtyard. And there's always a hideous 1970s wing. And that is where the people in charge of design always work, in a miserable office. So this building basically pretty much reached the end of its life. And there was sort of council bureaucratic re-administration. And I got a call from the head of the council, who I got to know quite well while I was working in Poundbury. And he said, Ben, can you come and meet me down here, down on the site, down on Weymouth Quay? And he said, there's something I want to show you. It was a bit of an enigmatic phone call. So I met him and we stood actually pretty much on this view. It's on a little bridge overlooking the harbour. And there's an amazing thing. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, and I don't know if I can point with this, but basically, sort of, you see the building with the sash windows on the end of that little Georgian terrace, and then there's a fence just to the right of it behind the cars. And you would see people walking down the street, and they get to that fence, and there is a way around it, quite a long way around it for the pedestrians. We know about pedestrian desire lines, where if somebody wants to walk in a direction and a traffic engineer has put a fence in their way, they'll sort of ignore it. And you would see kind of ladies lifting their kids' pushchairs over the fence and then jumping over and carrying on where they wanted to go. And he said, I need you to see this, because what you don't realize, because I didn't know the history of this place. He said, they're actually walking on the line of the old high street of Weymouth. And I was like, what do you mean, David? So what happened was there was sort of some bomb damage in the Second World War. Not actual bomb damage. When you look at the photographs, as I now have, everything could have been repaired and reconstructed very easily. There were some amazing buildings. There was an incredible Tudor house on the site, a really ancient house, basically completely intact. But because of a stray bomb from a German bomber, they'd just sort of they'd finished their bombing raids, they had a couple of spare bombs, and they just dropped them on the way out. That's kind of what happened a lot. And so 3 or 4 bombs landed on this little part of this beautiful Georgian town. The planning officers and the design officers in 1950 said, great, we need to clear away all of this and we can build ourselves a new office on the site. And so they built this building, literally surrounded by a car park, literally on the site of the old high street, which had been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the bizarre thing is that people are still trying to get from one direction up to the other direction. And today, with all of these barriers put in place, They still climb over the fence, lift their shopping trolleys and their kids over the fence in order to go the way they want to go. And David, the head of planning, I will give him his due. He was a powerful figure, now retired. He said, I needed you to see this because I want you to work on the project to reconstruct it. And it's taken a long time. That is our counter proposal. And it's taken years, actually, this one. It's got planning, thank goodness. And it's been stuck in kind of weird bureaucracy for, honestly, about 10 years, I think, since I did this scheme. But finally, it looks like it's unlocking, possibly as early as next year, which would be incredible. And the first thing we did was to restore that pedestrian kind of desire line that has been there for hundreds of years. Now, that's what I mean about slow time with urbanism, because the buildings honestly will come and go. But if you put your streets in the right place, they will last for thousands of years. You know, there are streets in the center of London which have been there for thousands of years. And the buildings have all changed. You know, the buildings were once Roman buildings, and then they were medieval buildings, then we had the fire, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't matter. But you know, this deep time of urbanism, of structuring settlements, is something that I think is profoundly important. And architects often think that the building as the object is the important thing. And actually, in the fullness of time, they will go. But the street network of the structuring of places is really important. This is the first phase of the development that we've done in Weymouth. So our site is actually literally just off screen. But if you look on the sort of the right of the photograph, from that greenhouse onwards, that's a little development that I designed probably about 10 years ago now. And it's actually a care home, and it's an old person's home. And the original design of that building looked like a sort of modern single blob office block. You know, just a huge, great big long building dumped in. It's built by a developer of care homes who have got a single basic architectural style and type. They're called McCarthy stone. And they do not invest very much in design at all, it has to be said, but they invest a massive amount in driving projects through planning. So they took it to planning. They knew that they would get turned down, and then they have a very expensive sort of team of legal experts who, in Britain, we have this thing called, if you lose a planning application, you can appeal the decision. And the lawyers know exactly how to get around every single little trick in the game. And so the council resisted, and amazingly, McCarthy and Stone lost their planning appeal. And one of the planning officers said to them, could you just come back with a building that fits in? And you look at the street scene and this beautiful kind of fine grain of building pattern that you find in this little harbour front. And it was actually quite easy to take their mega block building, which is actually lots of individual people's little houses, all just in a huge big building, and to break it down into a granular form. And that's what you see here. The white building, the 3-story element, is the sort of the main entrance front. And I have to be honest, when I'm talking about your design having a negotiation was real life, I couldn't show you a photograph taken any closer than this one, because you would see how, despite the fact that I gave the developers a full set of construction detailing for all of the stonework, which they refused to pay me for, but I gave it to them for free because I wanted them to do it properly. Despite all of that, they managed to mess every single detail up. So it's fine if you stand with blurred eyes from a distance of 500 feet. Anyway, that's just a tiny little project to kick us off. It's small, but it talks to me about this sort of the long, slow heartbeat of urbanism that is at the message of this part of time. This is a photograph of Poundbury. I'm sure many of you in the room will know about Poundbury, the new town conceived by the former Prince of Wales, now King Charles. He had, I'm not going to rehearse the whole story now, but he had, in the 1970s and early 1980s, so a long time ago now, he was a very young man actually, he had become increasingly troubled about the effect of architecture and urbanism on people's sense of health, effectively, all the different strands of health, mental, physical, environmental. He had spent a huge amount of his time visiting places and people, and he was making, in a sort of possibly naive, possibly ill-informed way, but just using the evidence of his eyes, he was making connections between the built environments that people were living in and actually their chances in life. And he began to think about this more heavily, more deeply. He began to talk and meet with lots of people who were actually all involved in the early movement of how this university and this architecture school became established. And in the early 1980s, in the mid 1980s, he made a famous, at the time, television program. And then on the back of it, there was a big exhibition at the Victorian Albert Museum and a book called A Vision of Britain. And it's actually fascinating. You can dig out you can find his TV program on YouTube. And given that, he wasn't from an academic or any form of expert background, and given that it was a long time ago, it's astonishingly prescient about many of the challenges that we are facing today. It's kind of an amazing piece of television. Shortly after he had published his book, land which his major estate called the Duchy of Cornwall, land which the duchy owns on the west side of Dorchester, which is this beautiful county town of Dorset, it sort of got circled by the local planning authority for more development. As so many places grow, you're obviously hugely familiar with what we would call urban sprawl in America, but let me tell you, it is not an American condition. It's global. It's everywhere in the world. And it's definitely been firmly embedded in Britain for decades and decades, since the end of the Second World War, if not before. Suburban sprawl. And so the Prince had just written his book. This land that he owned had been circled by the planners saying, right, we want another 3,000 houses here. This is how the town had grown. Every few years, they knew that they needed more houses for people to live in. No one was planning any of it. It just happened. And he put two and two together and said, I'm actually not going to agree to this unless we start to put into place different principles. And he had laid out a series of principles in his book. And I actually don't know, maybe somebody in this room does know. The one piece of the jigsaw puzzle that I have not yet connected is how the Prince of Wales met Leon Creer. I actually don't know who made the connection, but in that, and I will find out. The next time I come, I'll have the answer. But in that unity, effectively, of a master planner and a very committed landowner, they had the perfect ingredients to push through on a large scale with a powerful degree of commitment over a long period of time, what was effectively a deeply kind of experimental new town development at a time where no one in Europe was doing this. I mean, there were little ones beginning to happen in America, as we know. Andreas in Florida, it was all beginning to happen over here. But there was nothing like that in the UK at all. Now's not the time for a whole lecture about Poundbury, but I'll show you some of my buildings there over the years. And as we go through, I'll just touch on for the student body some of the kind of key facets of Leon's master plan. A vibrant mix of uses, a master plan that allows for many daily needs within a 5 or 10 minute walk of each home. So here's one of the little kind of nodal centers within Leon's master plan, surrounded by shops and cafes. The building in the middle is a cafe. You've got a little local store with a post office and various little local needs shops, wherever you go, beautifully located within the master plan. And that's one of the kind of squares which I designed about 10 years ago now, 12 years ago. A pedestrian-friendly master plan. So it's a very easy place to walk around. There are lots of cars in Poundbury. You can see them in all these photographs. We're not afraid of cars, but the streets are structured that it's actually easier and nicer to walk than to get in your car. It's quicker to walk than to drive to the shops. It's just quicker to walk down there and get back. A network of streets and squares, not roads and cul-de-sacs. Seamless and visually indistinguishable social housing incorporated throughout the development. So in this street scene, the first 7 houses on the left-hand side, you've got the arch building, and then that first run are all social affordable housing. And this was actually something which was really pushed through by the Prince of Wales. He was spending so much time in massive, in England we call them housing estates. In America they're sort of known as the projects. These huge housing estates, generally built by contemporary architects with huge concrete tower blocks, I'm afraid, in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, filled with social or affordable housing. People who can't afford to get their own house for whatever reason, and would find themselves on a local authority housing list to be housed by the local government. If I'm being honest and disparaging, dumped into places where there was no infrastructure for those people to actually live an easy life. I mean, just for a start, it's a pretty terrible idea to put a lot of socially disadvantaged people into a tower block that is utterly dependent on a lot of money to function. You know, it's no good if the lift breaks, if the elevator breaks. I always say there are sort of 2 classes of people who can live successfully in tower blocks. It's like very rich people or very young people. It's a highly exclusionary landscape to build if the systems aren't all working perfectly. What was meant to be originally designed in the sort of Corbusian vision, beautiful landscaped surroundings in between all of the tower blocks, pretty quickly turned into desperate car parks, very bleak places. What little kind of community facilities or shops that were put in, no one really wanted to go to them, so the shopping centres failed. And he was visiting these places all over Britain and seeing huge social problems that he was making the connection way before many other people, that there was a direct correlation between the architectural and the built environment and the conditions that had been created. So when he set up Poundbury, one of the absolutely guiding principles for the Prince was that he wanted to incorporate social housing mixed throughout the development in a visually indistinguishable way. There was a lot of pushback from the house builders. The house builders and the developers said, we'll never sell a house next door to a run of social housing. There was actually pushback from the social housing providers. They said it'll be a nightmare for us to manage because the Duchy had come up with a plan that it would be pepper potted around the development. So there wasn't clusters of it, but just kind of nicely spaced out all over the place. And he insisted, and interestingly, it's not perfect. It's not perfect. There are problems from time to time. There are problems of kind of problem families who are struggling, running up against kind of people in private houses. But it basically works really well. And a lot of data is now measured in Poundbury and tested with the residents. And this is one of the things which everyone is incredibly positive about, because it's actually part of what makes this new settlement genuinely feel like a very well-balanced, proper, normal, nice community, not a ghetto. And we're obviously used to building ghettos for all sorts of classes, whether they're, poor working class families or very, very rich ghettos. And so that's one of the great achievements of Poundbury, is breaking down those barriers. It's now completely passed into national legislation in England. A mix of different homes, and types rather than identical blocks. So all too often, as I was just touching on, develop how the modern world of suburban housing development builds individual housing types uniquely in a place. So you'll have a whole development of starter homes for young couples or rich homes for, rich people in gated communities. In Poundbury, Leon has done a massive amount of work within the master plan to structure different housing and different scales of housing kind of on every street. And it's a really powerful degree of variety. And then finally, and this is a shot that I had to get up extremely early one morning as the sun was coming up to take that last summer. This is a shot looking across the sort of the fields. It's still very much surrounded by an agricultural landscape. Looking across to Poundbury with Leon's various towers, which punctuate his master plan, crucial intersections. One of the really fun buildings that I got to design with Leon is that one in the middle, which is called Royal Pavilion, using architecture to create a sense of place and a sense of meaning. And it was very interesting. I mean, I'll try and rattle through, but Leo had to fight hard. I mean, I'm sure you've all met him. He is a fighter, and he had to fight to achieve the tower at the center of his master plan. And there was sort of nervousness in the local authority about a big new building on the skyline. Because obviously these days, we've all got ourselves into the mindset that any new building is going to spoil the landscape and make it worse. And so the entire mission of local government is to make new buildings invisible. So we have to do a thing in England. I don't think you have it here, but we have it in England called a visual impact assessment. It's a very technical thing. You get somebody who it's a whole weird industry of people who do these visual impact assessments, and they have, particular camera, which they have to go to particular viewpoints all around and take photographs and mark on the photographs how the new building is going to be completely invisible. And Leon was like, but I want my building to be visible. That's the whole point. It's a tower. And he won his argument by he doctored with an early version of Photoshop. I don't know how he did it. He took a whole load of photographs of Dorset towns and villages, and he Photoshopped out all of the tall buildings, like the church spires and the town halls. And he did a presentation to the planning committee. And he said, okay, I'm going to give you one go only. You have to name each town or village. And none of them could get any of them right, including a photograph of the building that they were all sitting in having this meeting, because he had taken out the towers. And then he played the slideshow again with all of the towers put back in. And obviously everyone could instantly say, oh, that's Sir Nabbas, that's Dorchester High Street, there's Sherborne. And he said, now you kind of get my point. Architecture, using architecture to create a sense of place. Anyway, enough of Poundbury. This is another duchy development that Stefanos mentioned, which it has been a great one to work on in a little city in Cornwall in the far west of England called Truro. Truro is an absolutely beautiful gem of a city. It sits surrounded kind of by a bowl of hills. This is the view from the site. This was another very early morning start photograph, I'll tell you. I mean, I'll try and hurtle through this story, but the Duchy of Cornwall owned this piece of land at a crucial intersection for a new park and ride transit scheme to come into the city. There's been a lot of suburban sprawl in Truro, and as a result of that suburban sprawl, for a very small place, it actually has horrific traffic congestion and transit problems. For a very small population, there's just like terrible congestion. So with a lot of innovation, Cornwall Council about 15 years ago put in a transit scheme, a sort of park and ride scheme, to persuade people to get out of their cars, park at either end of the city, with a system of free buses that takes you into the town centre and back out again. But in order to make the system stack up, it needed a node, it needed a transit point at either end of the town, of the city. And the western end got built, and that was all fine and operational. And the Duchy of Cornwall owned this tiny little nugget of farmland at the eastern end, which was Like when the engineers modeled exactly where they needed to put it, that's where it was. So they approached the Duchy of Cornwall, who initially just said, no, we're not putting a massive car park like on our farmland, sorry. And then a year or two later, the council came back saying, right, we've tested every other location. You own the best location and we need to work with you to deliver this. There are a lot of benefits and you need to see the bigger picture. So the Duchy began to think, fine, but how do we take that ingredient of, a big out of town car park, and stop it being an utterly kind of bleak place that has no sense of character. And they also wanted to put in a big food store and various other, there was a massive household waste recycling centre, which is normally a pretty horrific thing on the edge of the town. So we were invited to help design a master plan to bring together all of these elements. And crucially, we decided, I was working with my great friend Ben Bolger at the Prince's Foundation on the master plan, that housing and making a little place for people to live. There's a massive shortage of housing in Truro, huge pressures on numbers. We decided to build new housing. And I think originally, when it was first sort of posed to me as a question, I think the Duchy thought that I would be designing a little kind of fishing village, sort of little cobbledy streets and little cottages, because that's everyone's idea, and in particular the Prince of Wales's idea of sort of Cornish appropriate development. And that is beautiful if you're in a village down by the sea. But this is right on top of a hill, whereas you've just seen on the next photograph, you literally see for miles and miles and miles. And there's one thing that people didn't do in the 16th or 15th century in Cornwall is like build their house right on top of a hill, because it's incredibly windy and it has terrible weather. And so all settlement in Cornwall is in valleys, like really huddled into the landscape. In fact, you can't really see little kind of villages anywhere because you just look across from hill to hill. It's only in Italy, by the way, and sort of Europe that towns were built on top of hills, because they were always at war with each other. And so you built your house on top of the hill so you could see your enemies coming and, prepare your boiling oil pot to throw on them. But in England, we never really had that. In Britain, I mean, it's a very long time since anyone, kind of actually invaded us. And so for thousands of years, we've built our towns and villages like in valleys and on the crossing point between a river and a road. Like that's where most towns actually, even a city like London, the River Thames and a bridge. That's where it all started. There's a sort of reason for where settlements go. So here I was faced in Cornwall with this kind of like huge open site to build houses. And I said, I don't think that a little group of cottages is going to like cut it on this site. And I very gently steered the situation into kind of, let's think about, this is a very intentional form of development. I don't know if any of you have yet been to the amazing Georgian city of Bath in the west of England with its incredible crescents, 18 beautiful crescents. And I studied those very carefully. I realized that a crescent was going to fit perfectly into this valley, which the site was situated in. And I very slowly steered the conversation around in this direction. That negotiation was just with the Duchy. Then we had to go and meet the people of Truro, and they were absolutely furious about this project. They didn't want housing on the edge of the town because all of the housing on the edge of the town so far was incredibly ugly and horrible. So all right-minded people try and stop new housing development as a matter of course. They just can't help it, quite rightly. And it was a very controversial project. And the interesting thing is now, because it's actually been really successful, people really like it, that's the main crescent. And then tucked in behind is this little square of much smaller houses and cottages. We've still got 40% social housing mixed into the scheme, and the retail and the free bus into the centre of town. It's a really good place to live. And actually, amazingly, it's a development where, fairly frequently, I get a letter or an email from a random member of the public just saying, hey, I was driving through and I have found out that you designed this development and I'm really happy to say that we love it. And it's like quite a nice email to get when everything else is going wrong in life. This is a new town that we're working on, which again Stefanos mentioned, in the Highlands of Scotland. This is a CGI. So this is something which I use CGI a lot to actually as a design tool, so I can test how buildings are going to look. How is the whole street scene going to go together? How does it all look and feel? Very often developers CGIs, but absolutely no resemblance to what gets built. I'm sure everyone has been the victim of that in their local towns, where you see a shiny image, taken at sunset, and then the final product is there and it doesn't look anything like what it was meant to. That's the photograph of the same houses just under construction. Here's a photograph after a little while. You can see the hedges in and planted. There's another view. I'm going to tell you about the background of the town in a minute. This is a great photograph for me. On the right is the first resident. He's the first resident, or his family, of a town which one day will have 6,000 houses, so about 18,000 people or 15,000 people. And on the left is the landowner who's behind this whole story, who I'll tell you about in a bit. But the guy on the right was an electrician on the project, and he was just turning up, wiring, light fittings and sockets in the houses. And as they began to take shape, he was like, "This is really nice. I think we should move here." And he brought his wife down and they had a look at this kind of house, and he kind of had the keys. They snuck in, and they became the first ever resident. And that is the day that he got his keys handed over. And then here we go, one more shot. As time is, you can just see that thing I was talking about how time is the magic ingredient in urbanism. The landscape taking effect. Now, this is a little town which is very inspirational to our project. This town is called Inverary. It's on the west coast of Scotland. And actually, the guy I showed right at the beginning, Robert Adam, this town was designed by his father in the early 18th century, William Adam. And it's an estate town on the edge of a beautiful estate on the west coast of Scotland. And this tradition of planned, designed settlements is actually very long-lasting in Scotland. And so the story of Tornagrain starts about 20 years ago. The local council contacted my landowner, who's the guy in that photograph, who's called the Earl of Murray. He's just a big landowner in Scotland. And they said, "We'd like to talk to you because we're planning a whole series of new settlements in your area, and we'd like to come and talk to you and potentially see if we can purchase some land." This is on the edge of a beautiful city called Inverness, but like all places, Inverness has suffered horrible suburban sprawl. And so the town council, the local council, were actually taking an innovative solution at looking at all this. And they said, "We need to come up with a plan for the next 50 years growth of this place, because the last 50 years growth has actually been terrible." So they approached John, and their idea was to build 6 small satellite villages of about 1,000 houses in each one, all the way down the Moray Firth where John lived and owned quite a lot of the land, his family estate. And he listened, and he was quite troubled because he suddenly thought, hang on, this is just a different form of suburban sprawl. And so, to cut the very long story short, he had Andreas Duani to create a counter proposal to this idea. And the concept was that if we built all of that development in a single place, 6,000 houses, 5,000 to 6,000 houses in a single place, we can create a new town that is genuinely self-sustaining, because it will have the size and the scale that it needs for everything from health centers, hospitals, secondary schools, 3 primary schools, a new commercial high street, all all the ingredients that you need for a healthy place to live and exist. DPZ, Andreas, did the really fantastic schematic master plan. It was an amazing charrette process, as so many of these are. That's where I first got involved. It was about 16 or 17 years ago now, I think. It was a long time ago. And about 10 years ago, we broke ground. And my role, ever since then, has effectively been to be the sort of coordinating master planner, executing Andreas's beautiful kind of structuring master plan, but really making it real on the ground and working with all of the house builders and the developers to design buildings. So these are some photographs that I've taken of the first phase. These buildings here are all about sort of 2 or 3 years old. This summer when I was taking the photographs. There's now about 300, and that's one of the little local town centres. You can see the little shops in there, really trading well, doing successfully. Big mix of housing types, lots of new families moving in from all over, but rooted in a very local Scottish vernacular architecture. And amazingly, and this is also a place that is becoming locally incredibly popular. Like John, my client, the Earl of Murray, who's really the guy who's driving all this through, and is the one who's setting the quality controls and insisting that great architecture and great landscape happens. He regularly receives correspondence from total strangers telling him how glad they are that he has done what he's done. And that is an incredible thing, because most new housing in England is incredibly unpopular. People do anything they can to stop it. There's a little aerial photograph taken last summer of the first phase, looking over the town, and we're now sort of in the detailed phases of master planning out the next kind of quite big areas, and very excitingly, beginning to just one fragment of our new master plan is touching on the corner of what will become one day the high street. We won't deliver that high street for at least another decade, because we want to get the critical mass there so that when it trades, it really succeeds. It's got enough people to make it all work. But we're designing it at the moment so that we're thinking ahead and making sure that we don't make any mistakes for the future. Very different scale. I just wanted to pop this up on the screen. I have a fantastic New Zealand client who's a young property developer. He actually got in touch with me 2 or 3 years ago. It was right in the middle of the pandemic, and asked me rather sheepishly, would I consider designing a house for him, for himself and his family in Christchurch? And I was up for it, and I said I'd love to. And at Christchurch, I do know a little bit, because my other half is a Kiwi, so I've been there many times. And I sort of thought, I don't actually need to do a site visit I knew the street that Vinny and Tess live on, and he gave me video tours, and he gave me a site survey, and we did a load of Zoom calls. Of course, New Zealand was really shut up during the pandemic. I mean, you literally couldn't get in or out for about 3 years. It was a bit crazy. And we did it all through Zoom, and that house is now under construction, and it's been a great process. But he then said, Ben, would you consider doing some housing development projects for us? And he's got an obsession about simple, traditional, local architecture. And what he's doing as a developer is buying small sites which have got generally sort of bungalows, suburban bungalows, 30, 40, 50 years old, which were very badly damaged in the earthquake. There was a massive earthquake in Christchurch in 2011, and a huge amount of the city centre housing stock has been damaged beyond repair. And an awful lot of it is just sitting there with nothing actually happening. People sort of moved out to the suburbs, and the city centre is needing a lot of healing to bring it all back. So Vinny is buying these sites with 1 or 2 or 3 tiny little bungalows on, and then we're doing these really cool projects where we're sort of re-densifying the city suburbs. This is a terrace we've just built and delivered on Hastings Street in Christchurch. That had 1 house on it, 1 earthquake damaged building. So it's really fun. And I'm now going to sort of try and up the pace a little bit. How much time have I got left, Carrie? Not much. 9 minutes. Okay. We're about a third of the way through. Don't worry. That was the important bit, all of that. I'm going to talk to you now about some of the house projects that we're designing. As I say, when we reach the end, I'll just stop. These are some of the houses that we're designing. And then if we have time, and we may not have time at the end, I'll show you some of the decoration projects. So at a walking pace. So this is kind of like we're upping the pace a little bit. So this is a house which I'm glad to say, sketch, CGI drawing. This is a pretty fantastic private house on an amazing site on the edge of an old walled garden in Oxfordshire that has just after 2.5 years got planning approval. I cannot tell you like how long it takes to get planning for simple projects, but it has, and hopefully, fingers crossed, that stage of the negotiation of life over. I think it will all be going forward next year, which is super exciting. This is an interesting site, a house on the site of what was a beautiful, these are CGIs as well, a beautiful kind of 18th century house that, as so often happened in England in the 1950s, it was too big, it was too expensive to heat. The family who lived there didn't want it anymore. It got sold on and it got pulled down, got demolished. And so it's now got, bizarrely, which I haven't put a photo of, didn't want to kind of freak you all out, a sort of 1960s bungalow has been built on this site. And now it's been bought by a lovely new family who want to put back, not massive, but a really beautiful house on the setting. And that's an interesting thing because the existing house that's there at the moment has lasted for about 50 years, 40 or 50 years. So when we're talking about buildings and how long they last, the design and making a beautiful building with the best materials that people can afford is pretty key. That's a view of the new south elevation with its big deep loggias. It's actually been designed intentionally with very high environmental standards. Depending on exactly what form of heat we can use, it could be a passive house platinum accreditation, which only 17 buildings in the world have that, and none of them are traditional. They all look like spaceships. So it'd be quite nice if that one gets through to the technological point. To the sort of settling into the landscape that I think is that you can achieve with traditional and vernacular architecture. It's a farmhouse, and the buildings that you see in the middle here, the flint and the brick. Flint is like a sort of chalky stone, which you chop in half, and it sort of has this amazing kind of hard center to it, which is indigenous across the whole of the south of England. So most of the wall in front and all of that house with the sash windows and the slate roof there, that's all about sort of 7 years old. In these photographs. And I'm trying to design here a house that feels like it hasn't really been designed by anyone at all. It's just settling into its landscape. There's some of the material detail. And there's a new little kind of summer house that we built for them last year. If we've got time, I will rattle through this project, which has been a great one to work on. Came into my office a long time ago. I was quite young. And this is how it looked on the first day that I saw it. And it's an interesting building. It was an old 18th century house that had then in the 1980s actually had this very architectural front put on it, designed by Quinlan Terry. It's called Fawley House. And then it had this weird 1960s wing added. And I was sort of like, when I came to it for the first time, I was like, wow, if I'd been there in 1985, I wouldn't have probably put that on the... I would have said there's a bigger problem off to the side, which needs dealing with. But anyway, there you go. So we were asked by new owners to sort of have a think about how we could remodel the building, take down this huge wing off to the left and make it a little bit nicer. You see the bit in the middle, and then that's what we did. We knocked down all the stuff to the left, put 2 new wings on, and added a big screen and sort of, and so on. And then that was the back of the house, actually quite a pretty little Georgian house. but it had some strange things. You can just see hidden behind the trees, that sort of giant wing off to the side, creeping away. And we did that to it. So that was a really fun project. There's the side wing, which I keep on seeing photographs of it pinned up on your boards as I've been walking around the building. And there's another detail, the swimming pool house, the inside. And then so all of this work is brand new, designed in the office. It was one of those projects which came along at around the right time. I sort of had just about figured out how to detail a molding properly and what to do in life, but I had quite a lot of time on my hands because it was just me and like 2 others, and we didn't have that much going on. So it was one of those ones where we designed it to a sort of hyper level of detail, but we sort of figured out what we were doing along the way. Beautiful plaster ceilings designed by a wonderful plasterer called Jeff Preston. We worked very closely together. Little corners, the panelled library, and a hall, the kitchen. I always try and photograph dogs if I can, persuade them into the shot with a treat, and a bedroom. I'm going to hurtle through the decoration. This is what I mean about decoration being fast. So we've talked about these different paces of time. Slow urbanism, buildings which will be around for, you hope, a while, but not forever. And then decoration. So this is my own little kitchen at home in Dorset. When I first moved in, didn't know what to do, just painted it white. A few years later, I got bored of that, painted it orange. A few years later, got bored of that, we painted it yellow. Like, it doesn't matter, it comes and goes, it's fast. You can get bored of decoration, it changes, it's like fashion. It's a really high speed velocity thing. I will whiz through 2 projects, but I'm not going to talk about them because we're out of time. The first one is a house in Dorset, which was very, very dilapidated and degraded and was really falling to bits. And we did a big project working with somebody who you'll all know called Hugh Petter, who's a good friend of mine, one of the directors at Robert Adam Architects. He was in charge of the sort of the building repair and restoration. And then my job was the interior designer, and we did the interior architecture and the paneling, and all of that. And then I'll whiz through a final one in Scotland, which has been a slow project redecorating. So here's Chettle. You can see how degraded it was. I don't think I've ever seen a wiring situation like that. The whole house was about to blow up and burn down. This is what it sort of looked like when we were there. I will tell you a funny story about these. We were having a meeting with the sort of Historic England and the conservation officer about whether we could take this paneling detail off the wall. And they were sort of like, I think it could be original. And Tom, my client, was like in the room, and he was getting so bored listening to these 2 ladies blab on about blah, 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 blah. And he started picking at one of the pieces of paneling. And I was like, don't do that. And then the whole thing fell off in his, his hand in front of the woman from Historic England, who like you're really meant to be like treating the building gently. But luckily on the back of it was a barcode. And literally we just spent an hour with them sort of talking about whether, it was like, which era, was it from 1810 or 1830? Anyway, so the house had been rented out for a movie set, and it had been stuck on for the film set. So that was lucky. But this is what it all sort of looked like. This is halfway through construction. That's Hugh's kind of amazing work, kind of repairing the building. It was a massive project. Here's that room with its new paneling going in, which we designed in the sort of 17th century flavor. There's a wonderful photograph of the house I took last autumn in the sunshine, about this time last year, actually, all restored and put back together again. And some of the interiors, it's designed by a very famous architect called Thomas Archer, who was a wonderful Baroque architect. He was one of the very few 17th century English architects who went to Rome and actually spent a lot of time in Rome. And it's got a whole different energy to it as a result. Dining room, bedrooms. And then this is a castle in Scotland where we've been working for a wonderful family for a very slow project for a long time. Beautiful site. But I was brought there because they were rewiring the house and they wanted to know, should we just paint it the same color as it always was? And I was like, okay, I'll have a look. The green color that you see in the background is the color it was. And then we started looking at different colored greens. And this room, for years, for centuries since the house had been built, had been the drawing room of the house. And I sort of suddenly realized that the shape of it, with this kind of fireplace at one end, just made it impossible to arrange furniture to sit around in a nice way. So I actually turned it into the dining room. There it is, finished. This was the entrance hall being rewired. And that's what we've done now. I will say they've got some pretty amazing pictures and stuff. So, you know, and sort of ancestral swords for hacking away. Scotland was not like England. Everyone was fighting each other in the 17th century in Scotland. And here was the staircase. And my client's mother always used to joke that she said, I just don't know. I didn't pick the color. It just turned up. And so it was this really crazy purple, which we changed into that. Bedrooms, when I first got to them, pretty crazy places, finished now. And this has been the most recent room we've just done, the drawing room. And I'm going to end now with my tiniest project in the office, but it's my own. This is where Charlie and I live in the west coast of Scotland, which we're about to, we're actually going to move here full time next year. So we are doing a little building project, but the house on the left is our little kitchen. The house on the right is our little sitting room and our bedroom. These two houses were totally derelict when we bought them about 6 years ago. I mean, the one on the left was literally collapsing into the ground. There was nothing left at all. And it's still pretty basic. We don't have any running water, and our bathroom is a bucket filled with some sawdust. It is very basic, but we love it living there. And there's our little sitting room, and there is our kitchen. Which looks a bit like a sort of rural house museum, but it's actually where we live. It's freezing cold in the winter. And that is the end.
I think we need to do ourselves a favor and ask you a few questions.
Yes.
If you could answer them.
I'll do what I can. I know I've gone way over, haven't I, Carrie? Sorry, everyone.
Let's be at dinner at 7 o'clock. So we have about 10 minutes plus. So let's have a few questions. You can go ahead, Director.
Hello, yes.
Hi, thank you. I really love all the British projects, but I'm Australian, so I was interested in the New Zealand projects. If you could talk a little bit how you've developed that regional variety in there?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So Australia, I'm doing a house in Australia as well at the moment. And it's interesting there. I'm getting some feedback from this. I'm going to I'll speak on this one. I'll say one thing which is interesting is that in many of these sort of places around the world that were effectively sort of colonial settlements in the 18th century, it's kind of interesting working in those languages now because they definitely come with some challenging questions, if you see what I mean. Architecture in Australia has interesting meaning sometimes, not always easy meanings to grapple with. But I think if one is conscious of those and aware of what we're doing, there is still nonetheless a sort of a beautiful relationship between the simplicity of the classical 18th century ideal and its connection to local place that you can learn from. So the strange thing about working in New Zealand, of course, is that it was colonized by the British. Sort of about 70, 80 years after Australia had really been settled. And there was a sort of fascinating change in the local taste between, let's say, 1770, 1780, which is the sort of Australian vernacular colonial architecture, and New Zealand really, particularly the South Island, Christchurch, where I'm working, first began to be settled in the 1860s and 1870s, about 100 years, 80 years later. And the architectural language, the inherent architectural language of Christchurch is actually very heavy mid-Victorian Gothic taste, generally built with stone, looks a little bit like the university here, very heavy stonework, very kind of amazing, but very hard to reproduce if you're trying to build simple houses commercially in New Zealand today. So actually, Vinny and I have just made a decision that we are taking inspiration from a slightly earlier language, as you'll have seen in some of the, so he's spent a lot of time in Tasmania or Sydney, kind of looking at some of those early settler cottages. As you're probably aware, in Australia and New Zealand, and I have spent a lot of time in New Zealand, it's shocking to see how quickly it is suburbanizing with the most horrific forms of development. And the government in New Zealand is trying to legislate against it, but in a very half-hearted way. And basically people there just kind of, developers just build weird houses in black and white plastic. Like everything in New Zealand is just built out of black and white plastic and is just completely disgusting to look at. And they all know it, but he's doing incredibly well because he's designing traditional looking houses. And those are the ones which are turning out to be amazingly popular. I haven't quite answered your question, but we'll do so in the next few days.
How do you rate the chances of a revival in traditional architecture education in England?
In England, so yeah.
And did Quinlan approve of your alterations to Forley?
I've never had a detailed chat with Quinn about the alterations to Forley. I mean, I know him well, and he's never said anything about it one way or the other. I haven't ever asked him, just in case he doesn't like it. It would be too late now. So the first question was to do, how do I rate the revival of teaching of traditional and classical architecture?
We don't have a Notre Dame in England.
We do not have a Notre Dame in England. I mean, not quite the moment to tell it, but there was this amazing architectural school, which Stephanos referred to, which I was luckily enough to go to when the Prince of Wales's Institute of Architecture, now the Prince's Foundation, or now the King's Foundation, it's just been renamed, was just that place, based in a zany, crazy building in Regent's Park in London. And it was a very short-lived architectural school. It shut for kind of political reasons, effectively, in the late 1990s, and morphed into the pressure group design charity that the Prince's Foundation has become. And of course, it's done incredible work in many fields. But I was chatting to somebody the other day about it and thinking how amazing it would have been if that architectural school, instead of being closed in the mid-1990s, had actually had another 30 years now of doing what you're doing here, every single year, creating an amazing student body of people who are trained to an incredibly high standard and with a degree of thoughtfulness. I think it would have had a profound impact, and there is very little. But there is one architectural school in Kingston in London where there is a unit. Those guys have been out here, haven't they? Tim and Jono, which is doing amazing work. There's a Cambridge summer school now, which John Simpson is heading. I don't know very much about it, but I'm sure there are links in from here. So there are things happening, but it's sad to think about the lack of scale that we still have. It's a good question.
One last one.
Let's end on a positive note. Not feeling sad. Hello. Yes.
Very technical question. Your housing project, social housing, are they done in brick or any wood construction?
Insulation. Yeah. So technical question, how do we build in England? It actually, or in Britain, it changes a lot wherever you are in the country. All of that development in Scotland that I was showing you, the white rendered Tornagrain, all housing in Scotland tends to be built in timber frame because it's quick to go up and it's quick to get it sealed in and get the roof on and get the windows in, which is what they need because it rains the whole time. In down south, historically or conventionally, we build in masonry construction with concrete blocks normally, or terracotta block. And then face it. One more, quick. And then we'll shut.
Thank you so much. A follow-up question is, what is the skilled labor force like in England for being able to build in timber framing and structural masonry? Is there a
It's good.
people?
It's good. Yes. I mean, there is, as everywhere in the world, I think at the moment, there are big supply chain issues. We've got big supply chain issues in Britain, and there are big issues with getting kind of qualified plasterers and electricians and all the rest of it. That seems to be a big labour shortage. The housing market in Britain is cooling down dramatically at the moment, and that is going to have a positive effect on the labour market, the supply. Okay, I think we're done. No?
Just a second before we finish. I just want to point out that your work is both inspiring and beautiful and contrarian in the extreme, and is hinting to a world or towards a world that we need to get to and get there fast.
Yes.
So we're looking forward to the years to come.
Yes.
You're leading
Yes.
this fight.
Yes.
And to being here.
Definitely.
As often as possible.
I'd love, yeah.
Thank
love
you, Ben. Thank you for being with us.
Ah, Lucy.
And one more thing.
I think what I'm really
Both, you are such a happy architect, and